Picture yourself in a medieval dungeon during the harshest winter Europe has ever known. The stone walls sweat with ice, your breath crystallizes before your face, and in the suffocating darkness, you hear something worse than your own chattering teeth, the scrabbling of tiny claws on frozen stone. The English historian James Anthony Froude once wrote that wild animals never kill for sport. Man is the only one to whom the torture and death of his fellow creatures is amusing in itself. But he never witnessed what medieval torturers created when winter's cruelty combined with human imagination. These weren't just punishment devices, they were masterpieces of calculated suffering, designed to exploit every weakness of the human body and mind. Today, we're descending into the frozen circles of medieval hell to explore torture methods so visceral, so psychologically devastating, that even hearing about them will make you grateful for every warm blanket you own. And trust me, what you're about to discover will haunt your night nest. But first, let's talk about something that seems harmless until it's crawling across your face in total darkness. Beneath the Tower of London, there existed a chamber so nightmarish that its very name sent prisoners into hysteria, the dungeon among the rats. Imagine being shackled to a wall in absolute blackness during a January freeze. The Thames tide rises. Contaminated water rushes in, carrying with it not just human excrement and corpses from upstream, but hundreds of starving rats fleeing the frozen streets above. Can you feel that icy water climbing up your legs? Now here's where winter makes this infinitely worse. Rats are warm-blooded creatures desperate for heat. In summer, they might nibble and retreat. But in winter, when hypothermia is already shutting down your body, these vermin detect the warmth radiating from your flesh like a beacon. They swarm. They don't just nibble anymore, they burrow into your armpits, your groin, anywhere your body generates warmth. The psychological torture is exquisite. You can hear them squeaking, splashing, fighting over you in the pitch-black cell, but you cannot see where they'll strike next. Now, if you think being eaten alive by frozen rats sounds terrible, wait until you hear what happens when torturers added fire to the equation. The Chinese rat torture took the concept to an entirely different level of depravity. Picture this. You're stripped naked and strapped to a table in a room where your breath fogs the air. A metal cage, shaped like a dome, is placed upside down on your bare stomach. The metal is so cold, it burns your skin on contact. Through the bars, the torturer drops several rats, animals that haven't eaten in days, whose bodies are desperate for calories to survive the winter. At first, the rats simply scurry around the cage, confused. Then the torturer begins adding red-hot coals to a basin welded to the top of the cage. Here's where the genius of evil reveals itself. The cage bottom pressed against your abdomen starts heating up. The rats, trapped between scorching metal and your soft flesh, make a calculated decision. Metal doesn't give. Metal burns. But your stomach? That's soft. That's vulnerable. Using teeth designed to gnaw through wood and bone, they begin digging into your skin, through your abdominal wall, into your intestines. You're fully conscious, watching your own stomach become an exit route for panicked animals. The winter cold means your blood doesn't clot properly. You bleed profusely as 18 inches of intestine gets unwound by creatures small enough to fit in your palm. How long do you think someone survives this? The answer will disturb you more than you expect. But the church gods' representatives on Earth had their own refined methods. The heretic's fork was medieval Catholicism's answer to thought control. This device was elegantly simple. A two-pronged metal fork with spikes at both ends, connected by a leather strap. One set of prongs pressed under your chin, the other pressed against your sternum. The strap wound tight around your neck. Now, add winter into this equation. You're kept in an unheated stone cell where temperatures drop below freezing at night. Every muscle in your body wants to contract, to curl up for warmth, but you cannot. The slightest movement drives those spikes deeper into your flesh. Swallowing becomes agony. Breathing requires concentration. And here's the cruelest part. You cannot sleep. When exhaustion finally overwhelms you and your head droops forward even a fraction of an inch, the prongs punch through the soft tissue under your jaw and into your tongue. Survivors reported that after 3 days, their neck muscles simply gave out. The body betrayed them. The head fell forward, and the fork pierced upward through the floor of the mouth into the brain cavity. But death took its time arriving. What other devices did the Inquisition design for winter dungeons? The next one literally splits you in half. The Spanish horse, sometimes called the wooden donkey, stood 7 feet tall in the center of interrogation chambers. It was a triangular wooden structure with an edge so sharp that sitting on it felt like straddling a blade. Prisoners were forced to mount this device naked, one leg hanging on either side, with their full body weight pressing their pelvis onto that razor-sharp ridge. In summer, this was unbearable. In winter, it became exponentially worse. The wooden edge would be brought outside and left in the snow until it was frost-covered. When your bare genitals made contact with wood cold enough to freeze flesh instantly, the shock alone caused many to pass out. But then you'd wake up, because torturers would tie weights to your ankles, sometimes as much as 50 pounds per leg, dragging your body downward, grinding your sacral bone and spine against that frozen blade. The cold did something particularly insidious. It numbed the area just enough that you couldn't immediately feel the extent of the damage. Then, when guards brought you inside to thaw, the sensation returned all at once. Imagine frostbite and a crushed pelvis achieving consciousness simultaneously. Some prisoners begged for more cold, more numbness, anything to stop the feeling. Others were left on the horse for so long that the device genuinely split them from groin to rib cage. But there's one torture that involved a tool you probably have in your garage right now. Execution by saw. Yes, a common carpentry tool became one of medieval Europe's most psychologically devastating killing methods. The condemned would be hung upside down by their ankles, legs spread wide, in the frozen courtyard. Why upside down? Because it kept blood flowing to the brain, ensuring the victim remained conscious far longer than normal. The sawing would begin at the genitals and continue upward toward the head. In winter, the cold slowed blood loss, which meant victims could remain alive and aware for hours as the saw worked its way through their body. Hungarian General Michael Szilágyi experienced this in 1460 after capture by the Ottomans. Historical accounts describe how he remained conscious long enough to watch the saw cut through his own pelvis and into his lower abdomen before shock finally granted him unconsciousness. During the Ottoman conquest of Lesbos in 1463, Commander Mahmud Pasha promised to spare the heads of 400 Knights Hospitaller who surrendered. He kept his promise, technically. He spared their heads by sawing their bodies in half from the bottom up, ensuring their heads remained intact until the very end. The winter made this practically efficient. Bodies could be stacked like cordwood without decomposing while the executions continued for days. Can you imagine being prisoner number 350, watching this happen to your brothers in arms while you waited your turn? But medieval torturers hadn't finished exploring what they could do with water and cold. Water torture during winter achieved a special kind of horror. We know dehydration kills, but what about forced overhydration when your body is already hypothermic? Medieval French torturers would force between 3 to 16 pints of ice-cold water down a prisoner's throat using a funnel. The mouth would be wedged open with iron, the nose pinched shut, and water poured continuously until the stomach distended like a grotesque balloon. But here's what makes winter water torture uniquely devastating. Cold water dropped your core body temperature rapidly. The body's electrical system, the heart's rhythm, the brain's signals began misfiring. Prisoners often experienced seizures as their electrolyte balance collapsed. Their stomachs would rupture from the pressure, and the freezing water would flood into their abdominal cavity. The French poet François Villon underwent this torture in 1462 during an exceptionally cold winter. He survived, but witnesses reported he was never the same. He left Paris immediately after his banishment sentence, wandering into a snowstorm, and vanished from history. Some historians believe the trauma was so complete that he simply walked into the frozen wilderness and let the cold finish what the torturers had started. Yet, somehow, there was still one method more horrific than anything we've discussed. The intestinal crank represents the absolute peak of medieval depravity. There was no coming back from this one. It was pure execution theater. The prisoner would be strapped to a table in a chamber so cold that blood froze in pools on the stone floor. The executioner would make a careful incision in the victim's abdomen, reach inside the body cavity, and separate the small intestine from the stomach. The upper section of the intestine would be attached to a hand crank with a metal hook. Then, slowly, deliberately, theatrically, slowly, the crank would turn. 18 feet of intestine would unwind from inside the body, wrapping around the crankshaft like rope. The victim watched everything. The winter cold actually helped here, constricting blood vessels and preventing the prisoner from bleeding out too quickly. They remained conscious far longer than they would have in summer heat. Death came from a combination of shock, blood loss, and the simple biological impossibility of functioning without your digestive tract. But before death arrived, there was time, plenty of time for screaming, for begging, for the crowd gathered in the frozen courtyard to remember what happened to those who defied their king. Now, if you've made it this far, you're probably grateful you were born in the 21st century. Subscribe to Flow of History if you want to keep exploring the brutal truths they don't teach in textbooks, because history isn't pretty, but it's always fascinating.